You are listening to the Think Brick Australia podcast. Think Brick Australia represents the clay, brick and paver manufacturers of Australia. Brick by brick, our podcast will discuss technical information and architectural case studies with special guests. I'm your host, Elizabeth McIntyre, the CEO of Think Brick Australia. I'm very pleased and flattered to be here with Clare from Clare Cousins Architects today. And Clare, it almost feels like there's a group of us that have been on this journey now for the past 10 years, although it seems to have gone very, very quickly.
I know, it feels like yesterday, but yes, many fun times and fun parties with Think Brick.
So before we get started into why brick, and obviously you've been a jury member for 2 years, a lot of your projects that have been entered in across multiple categories has ended up as finalists awards. But before we get into that, I just wonder whether you could talk to me a little bit about how you grew up and I guess why architecture?
Yeah, I grew up in Melbourne and had the fortune of living in Europe as a child. My dad was a doctor, and so we lived in London when I was 8 and then Germany when I was 10, and fully immersed in a German school, which was really interesting. And I think even to some degree that experience of coming from living in the Melbourne suburbs to actually living in an apartment life in Europe was a very different thing that I've become more aware of looking back. And Australia had such an obsession with housing and less so about apartment living. And I suppose that kind of kept a connection with Germany. And when I finally finished high school and decided to study architecture, which was again a very last minute decision, I was sort of maths and science at school, did quite a few creative pursuits like drama and music, but hadn't really pursued creative arts or visual arts. But got to when I had to write the dreaded university selection down, I was like, actually, I just need something a bit more creative. So just took a stab at architecture.
Wow,
it was a complete fluke, really.
No one suggested it to you?
No, I literally was sitting outside the careers counsellor office and they said, sit at this computer, have a look at this list of professions. And at the top of the list was A for architecture. And, and then I went in and said, oh, what about that? And she's like, oh, yeah, you could do that. And I was like, okay, I'll put that down. I think I probably would have got home and my mum and dad probably would have encouraged it. So got into RMIT, and then, which was kind of a really perfect choice for me as a university. It was much more kind of conceptual and probably dragged me out of my pragmatic, sort of more scientific, analytical thinking and to sort of think more creatively. But then went and did an exchange in Berlin in my third year, which was again a great kind of personal learning.
So just taking me back to that, you've picked something that what I'm understanding is you really don't know what it's about. How different was that to what you thought it would be, studying architecture?
Yeah, I think even to the point where getting into RMIT, you had to, I think it was an interview and a little home assignment. And so I kind of ended up taking myself off to the local library before the interview and went to I think it was the Malvern Library, and went to the architecture section to kind of look at a few architecture books. I thought I better kind of look at what architecture is about. And of course, it probably had 15 books in the whole library on architecture, and it would have had all the kind of classics. There was the Frank Lloyd Wright and the Pompidou Centre. And I remember I kind of formed an opinion that the building I really liked was the Guggenheim Museum by Frank Lloyd Wright. And then one I didn't like was the Pompidou Centre because of all of its kind of exposed, I would have been completely inarticulate, but all the stuff on the outside, which ironically now is one of my favourite buildings. But it was that thing of actually going, oh, I have no idea. But I think as a 18-year-old, people underestimate that everyone has an opinion about architecture. Everyone has, lived in houses, been in public space, been to public buildings or institutions or theatres. And so we all have those experiences. It just becomes a developed sense of, or a heightened sense of understanding. So anyway, it was a real fluke, but I couldn't have chosen anything more suitable because it kind of gives you there's the arts and the science, and that's what I really love.
And engineering hadn't come up because you just said that you were a maths and science girl.
Oh, no, that's what actually the school was pushing me into engineering. And then I thought, I can't be an engineer for my whole I really loved physics and chemistry. And then I always liked doing things that you weren't supposed to do. So I kind of thrived in the kind of mechanic subjects of fixing machines, and because I thought, I don't expect a girl to be able to do this, but I can do it. And so I kind of often like going against the grain. But then I thought, it just didn't feel whole enough. Maybe that was what it was. I kind of felt like I needed something else, and that's what kind of made me think I need something that's got creativity as well.
And so I did interrupt you, but then you went to Germany on an exchange.
And so when I was 20, in kind of third year, I went to Germany, studied at the TU in Berlin, and again, just kind of blind ignorance really, and sort of lined up a lady to live with who was an English teacher in her 50s, rented a room in her apartment, and she was kind of wonderful to sort of spend the time with and go to the university and, you know, do all the classes in German. And I had my German was really schlecht, as I'd say, you know, very poor. Again, it kind of became an eye-opener too. We were doing a project, thankfully a group project, so we could design, and my friend had lived in America, so she spoke very good English, so we tended to design a bit in English and she'd do most of the presenting. But it was designing apartment buildings, and I kept wanting to create all these external spaces like balconies. She's like, what do you want balconies for? Because in Australia, it's all about being outside and it just wasn't done. The majority of the year is cold, and so, no, we don't have balconies. And it was just this kind of culture clash. It's kind of funny. We kind of think that we're so similar, but we're actually quite different.
And what other sort of architectural impacts would you say that you saw as really big differences that you learned over there?
Yeah, I mean, or even other little things, like there was a full subject. It was heating technology was one subject, because again, rather than we would have construction as a kind of holistic. So in Germany, I think they tend to graduate with actually an engineering component to their degree as well. So
Wow.
It's kind of a little bit different. But I think just being exposed and immersed in kind of European culture, and Berlin was a kind of fascinating place. It was back in 1996, so it was still only a few years after the Berlin Wall came down, and the East was kind of super gritty and slowly gentrifying, but also being in sort of middle of Europe, that you could just travel to all these places.
Yes.
So you go to Prague for the weekend, and you go to Paris and London, and it just, that prolonged year of studying for 6 months and then backpacking. And at the end of my semester, before I went backpacking, I kind of got a part-time job in a secondhand clothing store, which kind of, you know, honed my German, because you had to speak German because you were being paid. And yeah, I just think it's kind of such a rite of passage and such a great personal experience for any young person. But I think the exposure to architecture as a young architect is kind of priceless as well.
And did you, outside of that extra 6 months, did you stay longer and explore Europe, or?
Yeah, no, so I worked for a few more months, I think, in Berlin to save up money, and then did Italy and Spain, and had a few friends come over and kind of met with them backpacking, and you get into all sorts of, you know, experiences, getting kind of mugged in Barcelona, getting pushed over in train station, you know, all those kind of, but again, it was back in the time of, you kind of think, well, it's only kind of 25 years ago, but there was no email, you know, emails probably were just coming out, but it was 96. I had a calling card to call back to home, and it was really expensive. Like a phone call was like $20. I had a boyfriend in Australia who I'd kind of left, who's now my husband, which was kind of interesting. I kind of thought, oh, we'll see if this lasts. I'll go away for a year, but it did. And
He pined.
He
pined
kind
for
of
you.
waited, yeah. And so he and I wrote letters, and even mum and dad, we wrote letters to each other because it was too expensive to call. So it's such a kind of, makes you feel really old that it's so ancient, the method that we communicated. But now we've got this repository of these lovely letters of what I received from him and what he received from me.
And I was thinking the other day, like, remember when internet cafes were a thing?
Yeah.
You'd be overseas, you'd have to go in, pay your 30 minutes or whatever. That was probably like 5 or 6 years after that.
Yeah.
But I know all of these things that you've totally forgotten about. Yeah.
But even that you would just travel with this kind of lump of a lonely planet. You'd really obviously discover places, but you'd kind of ring a couple of days ahead, and you'd book in, and you'd find a little pension to stay in, and it was kind of like that was your Bible of how you would find things, whereas now it's totally changed.
There was no TripAdvisor back
There was
then.
no TripAdvisor.
No
Exactly.
Google Maps.
No.
Because you'd started architecture now and you're going around Europe, are you looking at it from an architectural lens, or did that not really come into it?
No, look, I think you do, but at the same time, there's still not, if I reflect back on it, I still think there was still a sense of innocence. There would certainly be architectural experiences, but I'd get a lot more of them now as a kind of more established architect or experienced architect. So it's that kind of blind, oh yeah, that's really, interesting, and this kind of complete immersion, because everything regionally is so different, and also you're experiencing things from someone traveling on a shoestring, and it's all those kind of different experiences. But yeah, I definitely think it showed the possibilities, but I'm sure there was a huge amount of things that I missed.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I just sort of wondered whether it had changed your view.
Yeah.
So you've stayed over there for longer than you intended, and then you come back to Australia. Was that willingly or a little bit begrudgingly?
No, I always planned to come back. Well, I kind of came back, and then it was my 21st. You know how that was always a big thing.
That was a big thing back then.
See your friends. But no, I think a year was enough. I mean, the architecture degrees are typically 5 years, and RMIT at that time had just stopped doing the year out experience. experience, whereas Melbourne Uni was still doing that. And that was a really formative system to encourage students to go into the workplace. But because it was early mid-90s, work had dropped off, there just wasn't enough places for students. And so I had actually worked in practice since first year, though, in smaller suburban practices. But no, I think the year was enough. It was time to kind of get back in. I didn't want to take forever to finish my degree, even though it still took me 7 years to do it. So, yeah.
And so just talk to me a little bit about the rest of the time finishing your degree.
I think RMIT was terrific, but it's not what I'd call it when I was studying there, not a campus kind of university.
Yeah.
That you imagine, that I would imagine something like Melbourne Uni would be, where you're kind of coming together and there's all the kind of social committees. Architecture school, it's a hard course and you work really hard, and then you tend to have a part-time job on the side to kind of pay for your living. So you kind of went in, presented and came back. And so I certainly had a few friends, but formed some great friends there, like Mel Bright from Studio Bright. But she and I had known of each other before starting there. We had mutual friends at high school, but then literally on the first day of uni in first year, we kind of met outside the building and went up in the lift together. And it was kind of this, interesting that we did that from the beginning and then have remained such kind of firm friends through.
Yes.
So it was really nice. We did our thesis together. Well, not together, but at the same time under the same supervisor, and did quite a few studios together. And so there was this, she, I think, went to LA maybe at uni. And so we'd kind of come apart and come together. And a lot of friends had studio spaces in the city, whereas we were still living at home with our parents. And so I would often, most nights, actually go and kind of study, and we'd make models together at her house. So there was many long nights drinking Earl Grey tea, sitting at her huge kind of AO drawing board, cutting models. And I was not a night person and she was the night person. And so she was always kind of, keeping me awake and functioning to get the work out. But it's a very taxing course.
Yes.
And but there's so much. It's one of those things. How do you impart all that information to a student about architecture? And I'm a big believer that the course can only teach you so much. That so much of it is learned from people and in practice, and it's why it's so important that students work in practice from as early as possible. And even if they can't get into an architecture practice, I worked for a builder at the Prince of Wales for a while, and in that job worked on delivering architectural work that Woodmarsh had designed. So you're looking at it from different perspectives, and it's giving you new learnings of thinking about things from a builder's perspective rather than an architect's perspective. So,
and that's such an important thing to get an understanding of, because you can, even just having gone through the process a couple of times now with my own renovations, you come in with all these ideas and then suddenly your architect says this is going to take 3 years, and you think, oh no, I'm a high achiever, this is going to take 12 months, and then you get introduced to the builder and they say it's going to take 5 years. So we were talking a little bit about your trips to Malaysia, or one of those trips. So tell me how you got back overseas again.
Oh yeah, so Mel and I had finished our thesis, and really we were sort of, can't believe it, it's kind of end of an era. And then Sand Helsel was our thesis supervisor, and she had a friend who was running a practice, an interior architecture practice in KL, in Kuala Lumpur. And she said, Huey needs a hand. She's doing these retail stores for Virgin, and retail design. This is kind of 2001. So retail design was not really yet a thing. It's obviously become enormous globally.
Yes.
And she's like, and we're like, we'll have a go. We'll design something here in Melbourne. And so we kind of came up with this, looking back on it, this hideous design. This kind of completely cliche kind of red ribboning kind of, anyway, whatever. But it was for Virgin. I don't know if it was a mobile store, but anyway, Virgin store. And then she's like, they want one of you to come over. And we're like, no, it's both of us or none of us. And so we were like, of course we want to go to Kuala Lumpur, all expenses paid. The owner of the business was Chinese Malaysian, had married an Australian man. They set up over there, and she just had her first baby. So they kind of needed help because she was kind of out of the business. So we went over. It was kind of this crazy 6 weeks. We went over there and she asked us to kind of look after her practice. Yes, Mel and I worked in practices as students, but we're like, sure, we can do that. And maybe there was a sentiment back then that maybe being that it was a British client in Virgin, then we had to keep meeting in Singapore, that they wanted that kind of English as a first language interface.
Yep.
And there wasn't probably people within the workplace in the practice to kind of take that lead.
Yeah.
But we were flying kind of business class to Singapore once a week to present to Virgin executives. We absolutely loved it. But then we were staying with the director's house. They had this lovely house in Bangsar in the kind of expat area. And then we'd drive in. Back then Mel was a smoker, so sitting with her in a car on the commute was fun. Driving on the Malaysian freeways, and then we'd share a bed shared a room for 6 weeks. It certainly cemented us as kind of sisters from different parents, really. So
Familiarity does that.
And then I had to head back to Australia after 6 weeks because Ben and I had a trip planned to Europe for graduating, and Mel was like, yeah, I'm not doing anything. So she stayed on and ran the practice basically, or worked there in a senior capacity for a year, which was amazing. So she had a great time.
Yeah. And then how long were you overseas on your second trip then with Ben? Was that a long
that was
time?
kind of 2 months, I think.
Okay.
You know, it was just one of those things where you think, okay, well, I've now grown up and I'm going to get a real job. How often do you get to kind of head away for 2 months? So, but interestingly, it was September 11 just hit. And so we were going on September 15, because I always remember it was 4 days after September 11. And so the world was this kind of different place.
Yeah.
And we were going to do Turkey and all these kind of interesting places in Paris and Italy. But we kind of, no one knew what was happening. So we kind of flew into Paris and did that properly, and then really just spent 2 months, which I love that we did Italy from top to bottom for 2 months. And it's kind of really nice to do one country, and particularly one like Italy where it's so regional, the food and the culture and the wine, and, you know, that you can do something from kind of top to bottom and really thoroughly, because so often I feel like you get to Europe, and even when we go over, we've been to Venice, you and I at the same time, and you kind of rush there and you go there, and it's kind of, you feel like you're kind of ticking boxes.
Yeah. And so just talk to me, were there any, when you're thinking back in terms of the early experiences that you had and before you decided to start your own practice, were there any projects that really sort of have stuck in your mind as fond memories, or on the alternate side, crying memories?
Oh, before I started practice?
Yes.
Oh, I mean, I remember making some fundamental mistakes when I worked for the builder. And so my role was contract administrator. It was a really small in-house construction company, and I had to meet the trades and order the materials. I had to order these kind of Italian imported terrazzo tiles for Aurora Spa Retreat that Woodmarsh had designed, but the whole fit out had been designed on the perfect tile set out, rather than just designing the walls and then cutting the tiles where you needed to. Everything was set out. So the tiles had to go down first. And I normally would pride myself on being very good at maths and good at calculating, and just totally stuffed up the calculation. So that thing, the old adage of measure twice, cut once, I should have measured twice before I placed the order. And it was like 12-week lead time on the tiles. And so the tiles arrive, we're probably 50% short of tiles. I don't know how I stuffed it up. And so it's one of those things as a young working, I mean, I was a student still then, that was while I was an undergraduate, but you don't sleep for a week. And then your boss is trying not to kind of yell at you, but trying to find solutions. And so you can't, I suppose some of those experiences are good to remember that mistakes can happen, and the person was trying their hardest and still stuffed it up, and that you've got to find solutions around that. So it's not so much an architecture one, but it's, anyway.
And then how did you come to deciding, I mean, I think it's incredibly brave to sort of say you're going to go out on your own and start your own practice. How did that come about?
I think it was, I kind of remember it just as I always thought I would. Maybe it's I don't know, I know when I started at Woodmarsh, and I was there for about nearly 4 years, I couldn't, even as a fairly young architect, I couldn't help but have an opinion on things. And sometimes I had to go, oh no, just hold your tongue, it's not your turn to talk yet. And so maybe there's that, it wasn't a confidence, but a desire to kind of take a lead on things. And maybe, I don't remember thinking, oh, make it easier later in life with children, because it sometimes does and sometimes doesn't. But it just was, I always thought that I would have my own practice. And I think I was always open to the idea too of maybe having a partner, and Mel and I were such good friends. But in some respects, I kind of found working in Malaysia, while we worked really well, it kind of cemented that wasn't, our friendship was more important than actually working together. And there's kind of some things that you end up, maybe we're too similar in some areas or different in others. And in some respects, Mel's is director of hers and I'm director of mine. But we're so fortunate to have, and with Amy as well, you can support one another's business and kind of really lean in on each other with regards to business and issues and architecture and whatever. But we're so lucky there's such a great collegiate culture, particularly in Melbourne, but even that's kind of expanded to other states. And
I think so too. That's the overwhelming feeling I felt being in this space. And I think that there's just all of us that thought we were going through, well, I thought that I was going through things that were completely different, and then we all got together and they were all the same. Yeah. And I think that's still the same now, except my kids are a lot older.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's a lovely, and I don't know, because obviously I haven't worked in any other profession for the last sort of 10 years, but it's a lovely thing about this profession, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, the women. But I guess you got to ask yourself, I mean, I look back at it and I just think, when we looked at emerging architects to be part of the About Face Awards. For whatever reason, it's really been sort of the female architects that really took that on and then have just been engaged ever since, and also then continued to design in brick. So it's been a lovely journey. Yeah.
I think what's interesting to me is how few female leaders, or more not leaders, but mentors there were, people in the profession to kind of look to when we were going through. And it's completely changed, but it really highlights, I think for us, it would have been kind of Kirsten Thompson was a tutor in my first semester, and then there was Shelley Penn, and there were certainly women, and then there was even older women than that, like Anne Cunningham, who she's well and truly retired now. And she was someone that I kind of went and spoke to because her husband and my father were colleagues, and to kind of talk to her about being an architect. And she used to do a lot of social housing and was a really interesting architect, but they were so few and far between. And so and I think there is that thing of you need to see it to be it. And and while you can still have great mentors, and I have had great support from male bosses and different things, it's great to see how many women are having much more of a leadership role, you know, in whether it be in large practice or running their own practice.
And their own practices are really successful practices. I mean, that was another thing I think we talked about, just looking at the Think Brick Awards and looking at, these people like yourselves and that had been with brick for so long, but also that's really intimidating. And so how can we get that younger generation not to feel intimidated by these great giants of architects with such beautiful history and wonderful projects? And then we started this New Entrant Award, and now every year 50% of the entries are from new entrants. And I think that's just fabulous. And I also think, gosh, what if we hadn't have done that? You know?
I think it is important to nurture that, in that to help level the playing field and to shine a light on that emerging talent, because for a long time that didn't happen across lots of award platforms or whatever. But even there was one, I think one of the early ones was the Institute of Architects Emerging Architect Prize, which I think I won maybe 2013 or 14. And Mel's won it and Amy's won it. It's quite funny really to kind of see, but in some respects it kind of, because it kind of elevated and pushed people to do things that they might not have put their hand up. You do have to, I think, push or encourage people, because often women can be reluctant leaders because for whatever reason. And I think it is really important, whether it be the Institute with the president role, kind of, I can fully see that was kind of John Clements getting in there and saying, oh, you should go into national count. I had no intention doing any of that kind of stuff, but we need to have more architects in general sitting on boards and sitting outside of the profession, influencing society and community about that architects don't just design buildings, that they're kind of design thinkers and are very good at solving problems, and they can be kind of broad ranging. And so if we can nurture that young architects, whether it be women or men, but sometimes we need to kind of encourage that and give them a platform.
I think the other thing that I guess constantly surprises me, and again, I guess it's we were talking a little bit about recruiting team members, but then even also with the awards, I think you can never just underestimate like putting yourself there, because you don't know who you're up against. It can be really good, or it could be absolutely no one.
That's right.
And I think that's what I've learned, just looking at some things, going, wow, that was definitely the year to put an entry in that category, you know.
But also sometimes someone's first project just might be absolutely standout, you know, for whatever reason, and that's fantastic. And so I suppose there is that kind of, you know, confidence level. But you've got to be in it to win it.
So Claire, you touched on it a little bit before, but can you tell me about your involvement with Nightingale Housing and what that is, just for people outside of Melbourne?
It's a housing provider that was founded by Jeremy McLeod, who's an architect and director of Breathe. And essentially, I think he took it upon himself to kind of build with a group of architects back in maybe 10 years ago, a building called the Commons. And that kind of was an 8-story building. It got great reviews, lots of awards. He kind of felt there needed to be more alternatives in the apartment area and something that was far more sustainable and nurtured community. And so essentially bought a site to do another development under the name of Nightingale, but needed to raise equity, because trying to get architects or funding for an architect, self-employed architect's a bit tricky. So he kind of contacted a whole lot of friends, and Ben and I ended up sort of micro-investing. He kind of got $100,000 lots to kind of build this project. And there's a whole lot of nuances that are a bit different to the kind of traditional market. But typically, multi-res is a speculative platform. A developer will build something, sell it, do pre-sales. They need to get a certain amount, and then people will settle and move in. And they can be owner-occupiers or rent investors. But there had been a real pattern in Melbourne because of a lot of housing was being built really as this commodity, and it was all about people buying properties, getting their 5% return, and ultimately I don't think there was a lot of care on what the buildings, how they functioned, how people lived in them. So it was really depressing. And really, an apartment in Melbourne, you would kind of think it's normally something at the beginning of life that you tend to have as a younger person or maybe older in life. But I'd lived in, as a young adult, in great 40s apartments, and they're built well and they're great, but many of the new ones weren't. So this was kind of an alternative to that, trying to show how it was trying to build a community. So it was not about a commodity, an investment for people to make money on. It was about owner-occupiers buying in. They develop a sense of community. There's diversity. So you might have young families, you might have older women. There was a real interest from older women, first-home buyers, and so that you get this kind of melting pot of people who don't want to live in a single house by themselves. They want that sense of community. They want that security of being on an elevated level, but also having low maintenance that they can kind of lock it and go or whatever. So anyway, it's a fairly long story, and I'll keep it short because I know a lot of people know quite a lot about it. But essentially, this one became the kind of first case study, and there are a whole lot of sustainable principles too, where it's kind of no fossil fuels, it's carbon neutral in operation, there's no gas connected, there's large PV panels on the roof, there's embedded networks and kind of shared hot water service. They're low cost to run, cars are discouraged, no air conditioning often. And now as the model has kind of evolved, there's a kind of a mandate to try and secure 15% of them for community housing. Providing. Which is great. So it's kind of evolved. That was finished in, I think, a few years ago, that one was finished. But we're now working on one where we're the architect and developer with 5 other architects, called Nightingale Village, and it's with Breathe, Kenny Nolan, Hable, Austin Maynard Architects, Architecture. And it's been a long journey and kind of a whole new skill set. So there's the kind of the architect component is the small bit. Yes. The developer part, that's the kind of huge steep learning curve, can be very stressful at times because essentially we had to kind of raise equity individually. We've got 24 investors in ours, and I ultimately feel extremely responsible, not only for the money I put in of mine, and we invested in Kenny Nolan's and in ours, but also everyone else's money. And so there's capped returns. It's still kind of a development at risk, that the funds are at risk. But what's so exciting is the kind of the collective. You know, it's 6 separate buildings. We're closing a road. We're turning that into more of a little pocket park, and just that a building should be far more than just what it is. It should contribute to the street and to the broader community. So anyway, it's due for completion later this year. We'll be excited to see it finished.
I just think it's another wonderful, pardon the pun, illustration of what architects can do, which is why I wanted to lead into it, because it was from those little things that I think it's just such a wonderful
and I think
contribution.
Too, it gave an opportunity for practices like mine, which we were mainly known for single houses, alts and ads and new builds, and really hadn't done any multi-res. And it kind of gives you that foray in a supported environment to go in. And now we're doing so much more multi-residential housing, and with kind of a focus on affordable housing and social housing, and we're even doing some specialist disability housing. You know, so it gives you that new insight, but also it kind of shows the benefit sometimes of having design-focused practices delivering those projects rather than it being done by practices that just dime a dozen. There's always that kind of commercial challenge and pressure on completely commercially driven developers. I mean, the good thing is the market has changed a bit in the last 5 years, that there are good operators out there that know that there's a more discerning public that do want more sustainably designed buildings, that ones that are going to last a long time and be good to live in. But the beauty with Nightingale is that it was design-led. So the architect is the developer. And so ultimately, if you're the developer, you control the purse strings. And, the budgets are tight. It's still got to stack up in the feasibility. But ultimately, we can choose whether we do X or Y. Whereas too often in commercial development, the architect isn't privy to the cost plan, is not always involved in the value management and the final iteration. And so I think that's really valuable, and it kind of speaks volumes about the value of design.
I totally agree. And I'm always curious when I said architects, was this design the one you started off with? And then you either hear the good story or the bad story. But with a lot of those big developments, they haven't been great stories. And you've had the main design piece of it being cut out, you know. So I think it's great.
And it's kind of terrifying when that happens because these buildings, they should be up there for minimum 50 years. And the actual cost of construction, if you look at the life cycle costs of a whole building, the cost of construction, delivering the whole building is only kind of 2 or 3%. And the running costs are kind of 85%. And then the design fees are like 0.2%. So it's kind of just crazy.
Yes.
Cutting things off. And I think there's a misconception often that, architects just make things expensive, or they just want to do this, or they just want to do that. But what I've actually found is because of the experience we've had delivering the village, that we have actually gained this huge insight and knowledge and empathy for the developer in how hard it is.
Yeah.
And because they can see that knowledge, I'm actually finding a lot of them are much more transparent. They can see the value that we can bring because there's not that kind of protectionist or cynicism that an architect's not going to, they should be the kind of active design lead and really a vital part of the whole delivery process of particularly that sector. It's such an important sector.
Yeah. I think it's really inspiring and hopefully it catches on as an idea. We will talk a little bit about brick now.
Oh, yes.
As I said, you've obviously built in it a lot. In fact, all of our products you've built in quite a lot.
Yep.
What attracts you to it?
It's so funny. I was thinking about this the other day that when I first started the practice, which was kind of 16 years ago, we took a little while to get some renovation clients, but we were putting forward brick back then. And I kind of think people forget quickly how brick was completely out of favour.
Everyone forgets that now.
I know, 5 to 10 years ago. And I would be putting forward brick and people go, oh no, that looks so suburban. I'm like, but it's brick, And so it's kind of completely shifted and changed. And also probably back then the types of bricks were much more limited, and there was this kind of association with kind of public institutional buildings and suburbia. So I think what's exciting about brick, when we're designing houses, even though we often know our clients and know how they want to live, but we kind of put ourselves into their shoes, and so you want something that's obviously going to look great but be low maintenance, long lasting. There's so many colours and sizes and proportions that can be used now, and I think you just can't go past the brick. You look at I live in an Edwardian house with a brick addition at the back. It's over 100 years old and the bricks still look fantastic. They were probably painted at one point, they were stripped again, they're back to red. It's a no-brainer, really. Yeah. And particularly in Victoria. I mean, what's interesting, we've got a couple of architects in our office that are from WA, and in WA, apparently it's all cavity brick, whereas here we're all brick veneer. It's kind of funny, isn't it?
It's shocking.
So, but yeah, no, I think that's, so it's very rare for us to do a project that's not in brick. You'll be pleased to know, Elizabeth.
It's not a prerequisite, but I am curious, and you're absolutely right. Everyone forgets, or they want to forget how different it was 10 years ago. Yeah. But I remember, we couldn't get architects to build in brick. Back then we were doing a conceptual competition. And in fact, I was discussing with Mel the other day, the reason we did a roof tile conceptual competition, which she participated in, because the architects that had designed and built in brick, like Debbie Ryan from Charles McBride Ryan, she was like, well, we've actually built, why aren't you rewarding us? And it was a fair call. And then I had to take this real sort of look at how do we change this up, because now we're starting to see people are designing in brick. And when we look at the entries now, there's just, you don't take it for granted, but they're everywhere. Yeah. So,
well, I think what was the material of choice? It was a lot of render, wasn't it, back then? Everything was rendered, but probably metal cladding or timber.
There was a lot of lightweight, I think, and everything was rendering, but it was all cracking. So everyone was starting to see render didn't go so well, or required a lot of maintenance, as you've touched on. So, but then again, you're right around. Everyone thought there were just two colours and all of these things. So,
but I think too, I suppose we used to have all the kind of challenges with councils too, with facade articulation as one of the kind of requirements that they needed. And it's render. Typically, you can do some really nice cement renders, but it kind of can have a flatness to it. Whereas the beauty of something like brick with that repeated module, there's all the kind of laying methods, but even a simple brick wall, the way the sun hits it and the colour variation. And I still remember Roger Wood from Woodmarsh, when I worked for him, he used to use the example when a planning officer complains about a building not having articulation. He always used to say, you just look to the NGV. It's like this huge wall of just one material of bluestone, it's in kind of big slabs, which kind of brick format. And it's so true, because the inherent quality of the material is the beauty that all you need in that kind of
Yes.
facade, and it's this kind of enormous wall, and of course everyone loves that. So that was always a good thing that I kind of pull that one out from time to time, steal that from him.
And Claire, you've obviously been the president of the Institute of Architects, and what is that how has that changed your perspectives about the role of architects, or hasn't it?
No, I think it has enormously. I think it's very easy to get to be head down, bum up in practice. Practice is busy and can be all-consuming, and I think getting involved more in the Institute really opened my eyes to the importance and the necessity for advocacy and policy change and getting out there and talking about what architects do. And again, a bit like before, I think there's often this misconception that architects they're just focused on aesthetics and building nice buildings. And it's, while there might be some architects that's their primary driving aim, the vast majority, I would argue, are completely passionate about the built environment, the cities we live in, the environment, the urgency with climate, the crisis that we've got currently, and what makes our cities and towns good to live in. And so I think, again, taking on that role was a kind of steep, unexpected kind of learning curve, and something, again, the skills you wouldn't kind of learn running a practice, and some challenging bumps along the way. But it was, I don't know, it's really interesting. And it forces you to do all those things that you find really difficult, like public speaking and live interviews on radio and all that kind of stuff, which is terrifying, and writing. It's not my expertise, but there was people to help with that. And I think I've always been a big believer in kind of continually pushing yourself with things that you find difficult.
Yes.
Because it's just, you get better at them, and I still remember having to give, I think, one of my first kind of, I can barely call it a public lecture, but it was just a lecture to RMIT students in the lecture theatre I always used to attend as a student. And I probably would have been only a couple of years into practice. And so you kind of look at where you've been and where you can get to. And I still hate doing live interviews on radio or any of that. It's terrifying, but it's good for architects to have a voice and to be, because we often, I think, have struggled as a profession to be, I think architects should be listened to and revered like the AMA or the medical association or lawyers are, because I mean, much like the AMA, they're looking at public health and the public good, and I would argue that that's what the Institute and architects really are there to do as well.
I would agree with you on that, yes. And I think I'm a bit similar to yourself. I think if there's something I don't like doing, I just make myself continue to do it. And then people say, you must love doing that. And it's like, no, I'm just trying to get better at it.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Or get over it, so it doesn't.
And I think what's interesting, I mean, I certainly had a few people in the early years go, oh, you were really nervous. And you can kind of tell, but so often you think you're doing worse than you actually are too.
Yes.
So the one thing I always said is, don't admit that you're nervous. Don't admit that you're not good at it. Just do it. And there's often that kind of imposter syndrome of feeling, why am I doing this? And someone said to me the other day, she said, oh, I'm so nervous, I'm not very good at it. I said, I could not tell.
Yes.
You do have to kind of fake it till you make it sometimes.
Yes.
But you can still do that authentic way. And I actually think showing vulnerability is an endearing quality too. And I think that that's something that's maybe people have become more accepting of. And people are interested in a story. They don't just want this kind of something to be sort of spoken at, I think. So I don't think there's anything to be, and that took me a little while to kind of get my head around. Yes. But I think it's really interesting.
It's
actually.
True. Yeah. We've talked a little bit about architects, but where do you see brick going in the future? Or
question. I think there's got to be more, as in across the board in construction, because construction is such a consumer of material, and brick is already this long-lasting material, and having longevity already makes a material really sustainable. But I know there's been some innovation with some bricks on, more green bricks, where they're kind of, there's not as much energy that goes into the kind of manufacture. So I think that's an interesting thing to kind of develop. And there's certainly, other great thing with brick is often it's kind of very local. We have had a tendency to be using quite a few bricks from WA though lately, so I feel sort of slightly guilty that they've got to travel a bit further. I don't know. I still think there's, as much as there's still interesting shapes and colour, which is often related to the clays, I still go, wouldn't it be great if there was a colour like this? Or, so I still think that there's more, because there's such an appetite and such a demand for it.
Yes.
For bricks, that I still think there's kind of more, I think, shapes, colour, as in shapes, not necessarily even the rectangle, but like, are they profiled? Or I think there's some exciting directions that bricks could go in.
Well, Claire, thank you for your time today. We're going to head into the rapid fire questions here, and all answers are acceptable, and I will try not to interrupt. Reading the news, a newspaper or online?
Definitely in a paper, in physical paper.
Physical paper.
Yeah.
Handwriting or typing?
Probably typing. I'm much quicker at typing.
For sketching ideas and concepts, would you use a pencil, pen, or an e-pen?
Yeah, no, I use a pen.
A pen.
An Artline pen.
Artist.
And a fat one and a thin one.
Do you like to read books or listen to audio?
Definitely books. I'm still not onto the Kindle. I kind of love a paper book in my hand.
I can't.
So, yeah.
What's important to you, style or substance?
I think an equal mix of both.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee in the morning and tea for the rest of the day.
TV shows or movies?
Movies.
Antique or brand new?
Vintage.
Okay. Call or text?
Call. I love a chat.
Travel back in time or into the future?
Oh, it's a bit pessimistic. I'm kind of scared of, I'm not sure what the future holds, so definitely back in time.
Exterior. Some people have said they're too scared to go back in time. Exterior or interior?
Interior.
Video games or board games?
Board games.
Form or function?
Equal parts.
Complex or simple with relation to design?
Simple.
Claire, thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you have enjoyed this podcast, please follow, rate, and review our podcast. We are always looking for new ways to think brick. If you have an idea of what you'd like to hear about, there's a link in our show notes to let us know.